This changes the tone a little bit. Reading all these stories in Matthew, all these arguments between the authorities of the time, whether they were Pharisees, who were the teachers, or Sadducees, who were sort of the legal experts, Herodians, who were collaborators with the Roman occupation and the puppet king of Judah, Herod. Each of them, of course, are factions, sects within the life of Judaism, within the life of the people in Galilee and in Judea in that moment. Each of them had their own agenda, but all of them pretty much agreed that this Jesus character was bothering them and that it was just about time to do something about him. So they set out, time again, to try to trap him. They're asking him questions. They're asking him questions, public, embarrassing questions, they hope, that will give them grounds to arrest him and discredit him and ultimately get rid of him, take all of the support that the people are giving to him away. If that's what they're trying to do here, they failed. Miserably. Because it was a stupid question. It was a softball question. This is the sort of question that Jesus didn't have to actually think up an answer for. It was already handed to him in rabbinic literature, in teachings of the time. This is a softball question for Jesus. Jesus, which is the greatest commandment? Well, which rabbi do I want to quote tonight? As it is, he quotes Moses. He quotes Deuteronomy. He quotes Leviticus. He quotes the law given by God to Moses, to the people in the midst of the Exodus. There's nothing there to argue with. It's an interesting line of question and answer at the end of this long theological debate filled with unexpected reflections, twisting parables, and really uncomfortable mirrors. It is, if you will, a summary of the fullness of God's wish for us. Love one another. It seems such a simple answer. This one that finally everyone agrees on. It is simple to quote something. I wonder if it was simple when the words were first given. The books of Moses, yes, and the books of the law were meant to set new rhythms and understandings for a life lived in God-given freedom rather than in slavery and oppression. We have reflected on this in terms of the Sabbath. All the laws laid out throughout these books, they're there not just to give people rigid structure, but to set up the ways of being in community that best reflects the life that God desires for God's people. One in which the belovedness and the blessing of creation All of creation is honored and affirmed, one in which the people show their love for God by the ways in which they love one another. And that community is such a huge shift for the ancient Israelites. It is such a huge shift for people who are coming out of generations of competition and anxiety around productivity and worth, for generations of people who have been raised only to labor and been told that that is all they are good for. It is such a shift for them to move into a headspace, an instinct towards unconditional love and unconditional worth when these are concepts that they can barely even imagine. How do you get people who are coming out of generations of trauma, whose lived reality has long been fear and oppression, to live into laws and commandments that are centered on love, with all of its necessary vulnerability? Vulnerability and trauma don't hang out well together, do they? I have talked with many of you in the past about how trauma works, so this might be a little bit of a refresher course. Bear with me. I'm cute. Just let it go. Trauma removes our sense of what is safe. It removes our sense of what is normal. It rewrites our narratives of control over our lives and our environment. The concept that if A, then B. Trauma changes the meanings that we ascribe to ourselves and to our actions, as well as to the actions of those around us. Indeed, the whole devastation of traumatic event or moment is in the shattering of our perceptions of the world, the loss of the safety and control that, while we know it is an illusion in the first place, had at least given us enough of a sense of foundation to be able to build a life for ourselves. Trauma is what happens when our sense of cause and effect, our perception of how things are supposed to be, stands in direct contradiction to the world as it is. It is when we are yanked out of our illusions and forced into a reality for which we have no narrative and out of which we struggle to make meaning. And in all of that, trauma changes our brain. It rewires us in brokenness and fear. It anchors our life to the traumatic event and the grasping for stability and control over a life that has lost the meaning we trusted. What does that have to do with anything? Well, people in the Sinai, those ancient people, hearing God's command to love, were a people who had long known trauma, who had been driven by hunger into Egypt in the first place, where they were then, a generation or so later, enslaved. And they had spent the generations between that enslavement and their liberation seeking safety within a context over which they had no control. So you have to wonder, how did they hear those juxtaposed commandments to love God and to love neighbor, when love had not been their way of life? As they approached the end of their journey, 40 years after their liberation, as they saw the land that God showed Moses in our reading, this land that is now the site of battle, using godly blessing as a pretext, as they looked out over that inhabited land where it had been promised they could make their home, did they approach it with a love of God? Did they approach it with a love of neighbor? Was 40 years of travel and 3 whole books full of law and commentary on how to live life differently enough to overcome generations of trauma? The people entered a land already inhabited, and they endeavored to wipe out those who were already there, whom they couldn't conceive of as neighbor, because their trauma told them, even generations later, that sharing land could not be safe. So what was theirs must be theirs alone, no matter the cost. And so the people waged a war in the name of a God whose love they had made conditional on violence. whose love they could not perceive or understand outside the ways that they had long known, the ways of injustice and oppression and fear. The people commit genocide in the name of the God who calls us to a love that heals the pain that we so easily inflict. Because the thing about trauma is that it endures. It nestles down within us, it changes us until the trauma itself becomes our new normal. And we grasp at things that perpetuate trauma because those take on the illusion of safety. Those become the things that are normal in our lives. And we recreate, re-experience that trauma over and over again. We cling to guns. We cling to battle and violence because we imagine that fear keeps us safe and that deterrence our security. But these are trauma responses. The feelings of fear and anger, the responses to the initial trauma, take root within our bodies until they become so known that they are comfortable. Until the trauma itself becomes the lens through which we understand our lives, through which we make meaning, by which we define how things are supposed to be. And in so doing, we perpetuate the trauma, and trauma responses become our norm, become our personality, become our culture, become the only way of life that we can ever imagine. So a traumatized people arrive in an inhabited land, one in which God has promised that they can make a home, one in which they believe they will be safe. A traumatized people who have endured oppression, not just in living memory, but over the course of generations and centuries, scapegoating and persecution, violence and rejection, even in places they went hoping for a better life. And they carry that trauma with them. They carry that trauma in their very bodies. They carry that trauma in their DNA, it turns out. They carry that trauma and they perpetuate it because fear has become normal, isolation has become normal, anger has become normal. It is just the way things are. They perpetuate their trauma an impulse to self-preservation that is inherently destructive, not just of those whom they seek to obliterate, but of their own well-being, as violence inevitably begets violence. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That last part that Jesus quotes comes at the end of a longer passage in the 19th chapter of Leviticus, which goes like this. You shall not render an unjust judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great. With justice you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not profit by the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate in your heart anyone of your kin. You shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Sometimes God gets right to the point. Love your neighbor. Refuse injustice. Refuse slander. Refuse hatred. Refuse vengeance. Active verbs, though. Refuse. Consciously. Deliberately. Refuse. Refuse the world that your trauma would create. Refuse the normal that your trauma insists upon when it does harm to another. Love your neighbor. Acknowledge the trauma that might not even have happened within your lifetime, but which has been carried down in family systems and cultural norms in a sense of right and wrong that is more self-protective than it is compassionate. And then love your neighbor. Love your neighbor, said God out there in the Sinai. Love your neighbor, said Jesus to people under Roman occupation and local collaboration. Love your neighbor neighbor, say our scriptures, to our culture, which is built upon injustice and colonialism. Love your neighbor in ways that the world will never tell you to do. A commandment that holds up, for all its simplicity, the biggest mirror of them all. How do we love from a place of trauma? How do we hold ourselves in the vulnerability of caring and offering our hearts openly, easily, when our brains and our bodies are rewired sometimes for generations upon generations to refuse anything that makes us feel unsafe or weak or dependent? You shall love God. Well, yeah, okay, we can do that. That one feels easier. That's the obvious ready-made answer, isn't it? The theological disputes and really to, most of our prayer lives. We can love God, especially when we are very, very good at making God in our own violent and vengeful image. But we only love God as much as we love all that God has created and blessed. We only love God as much as those whom we patronize, those whom we dehumanize, those whom we dismiss as unworthy or absurd. We only love God as much as we love our neighbor, who has as much right to land and resources and love as we do. Indeed, perhaps we only love God as much.